Hi, everyone. Welcome to Smarter News. My name is Jenna. And once again, today we have the great benefit of being joined by someone with incredible insight into the topic of our times. And we're really handling three different headlines related to Eastern Europe in one news cycle. And we're going to work through all of these. One is that we're coming up on the anniversary, lack of a better term. We don't like to say anniversary, but we're marking the end of the second year of war in Ukraine and moving into a third. We have the news of the death/murder. We'll talk about the choice of words there, of a key opposition leader against Vladimir Putin who had been in prison for years and mysteriously died. And we still have very little details. That's still evolving. That's still an evolving story at this time. And we also have this high-profile interview that American host Tucker Carlson conducted with Vladimir Putin, a 2-hour interview, one of the most watched interviews with Vladimir Putin in recent memory. At last check, 205 million views of that interview. And so that's made headlines around the world. So as I was looking at these headlines in front of us, I couldn't help but reach out again to David Satter. And you'll know David Satter because he's joined us before, graciously agreed to join us again. He has worked for decades reporting on Russian affairs. He reported inside the Soviet Union, saw the fall of the Soviet Union, saw the rise of a little known person by the name of Vladimir Putin, and continued reporting from this new Russia, this post-Soviet Russia, until 2013, when he became the first U.S. correspondent to be expelled since the Cold War. And again, his level of expertise, his insight into the Russian culture really is unmatched. And David, I appreciate you joining us again, because when I think about who else, you want always to present a lot of different guests to our audience. I think that's important. But when I think about these actual issues, there's only one person I want to talk to, and that's you.
Thank you
So I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
We've really made this an annual event. I was looking at over the last couple of years. We've talked really since the beginning of the Ukraine war, and there's been a series of things that have come up since then. And I was looking at the date today, David, and we, just so everyone knows, we were sort of coordinating. There's a lot of different schedules. David's obviously very busy, has a lot of work in front of him, a lot of travel, and we ended up arriving at today, which is February 20th. And I was looking up the date of when the Ukraine war started. And February 20th, 2014 is when the first chapter of the Ukraine-Russia conflict started. I should say the first modern chapter. Again, started February 20th, 2014. It was February 24th, 2022, when there's an agreed upon date, and it's kind of tough to know when this latest iteration of the war took place. So we're in the anniversary week. And I'm just curious your observations as someone who knows Russia, speaks Russian, writes Russian, has contacts still all over the world.
The war began 10 years ago, but the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began 2 years ago. So the war was to a certain extent limited. People were dying, and there were some terrible events, including the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian Boeing, in 2014. But now we face full-scale war on the scale of the Second World War, in terms of the number of casualties, the size of the engagements, the cruelty, and the obvious aggression in all those respects.
Does it surprise you that we're here, David? That we're here closing out a second year, heading into a third?
Well, of course, the resistance of the Ukrainians has been inspiring and magnificent, and something that we could not have been sure of at the time of the invasion, because Russia has vastly greater resources. But in fact, we now see, with the benefit of hindsight, that the Ukrainians are totally committed, and that they're fighting very, very well. And it's really a question of quality versus quantity. The Russians are compensating for poor tactics, for poor coordination, for poor planning, for lack of morale, by throwing people into battle who are not prepared for battle and are treated simply as cannon fodder in enormous human waves. The Ukrainians are simply astounded by the willingness of the Russians to sacrifice soldiers for no apparent strategic gain. They don't value the lives of their soldiers at all. But it's going on, and that's why we're in the relative stalemate that we see at the present time, because Ukraine badly needs modern weapons in order to compensate for the overwhelming advantage in manpower that Russia has, and Russia's willingness simply to sacrifice its soldiers without limit. Any other country would not be willing to take these kinds of losses.
Why is Russia?
This is the mentality that has been bred in Russia over centuries. The idea that the individual has no importance, the only thing that matters is the state. And the propaganda of the Second World War, which is continuous in Russia, is that Russia was willing to accept any number of casualties in order to be victorious. In Leningrad, or now it's called St. Petersburg, there are monuments to the 1.5 million people who died in the siege of Leningrad. And they're constructed in the areas where there are mass graves. In those mass graves, there are hundreds of thousands of people buried. But there's no acknowledgement of the tragedy of these losses. The fact that these were people with hopes, with aspirations, with virtues and faults like all people. Instead, there's a monument to the great victory, as if these people had no significance at all, except insofar as their lives contributed to the victory. Well, this is the message that is constantly inculcated. When I was living in Russia, I used to take the train from Moscow to what was then called Leningrad, from one hero city to another hero city. At first I was sort of amused by the Soviet habit and which has been continued in contemporary Russia, of calling cities that were important in the Second World War hero cities. And it was only after I'd been there for a while that I realized how sinister it was. That this is a country which is organized like a movement that is always prepared for war psychologically. I can tell you a story just to illustrate it, if you'll allow me. I took the train from Moscow to Nakhodka on the Pacific Ocean, the Trans-Siberian Express, and got on a boat to Yokohama in Japan. We were on the boat. This was a Russian boat. I flew back to Moscow. I was a Moscow correspondent from Tokyo. Anyway, on the boat one night, it was very quiet. We were progressing, moving over a very quiet, calm sea. The moon was out, and a number of members of the crew gathered because it was very unusual in those days for an American correspondent to be on that boat, and they were all interested in talking to me. And one guy was playing a guitar, and then suddenly the conversation was interrupted. And a girl said, "Well, tell us honestly, do you think there's going to be war?" And I said, "War? We were in the middle of the détente period. Why are you thinking there's going to be a war?" But and then they began to speculate and said, "Yeah, I think there will be a war. That war is inevitable, and so on and so forth." That's the way a lot of people in the Soviet Union were really conditioned to think. So when they launched this war against Ukraine, they didn't really need, we say, well, isn't it obvious aggression? But the fact is, the psychological state of people is they don't really need a good reason. It's enough to propagandize them a little bit with state television. You know, the enemy in the Second World War were Nazis, so we say that the Ukrainians are Nazis. The fact that Ukraine had free elections, whereas Russia did not. The fact that right-wing parties are present, but they're a very small percentage of the of the uh, uh, of the population in terms of support. I mean, nobody asks that question. And right now inside Russia, what's going on is that the patriotic chauvinistic fervor is being ginned up through every means available, and so people
Like
and
what?
those
Like
and
what would
those
that look?
who are going are being showered with money. By the way, also, yeah.
So what would that look like when you say that that's being ginned up? What would that?
That
What does that look
everything
like in
that's
Russian
possible to
society?
celebrate, they're celebrating it. They're creating new holidays. For example, November 4th was the anniversary of the defeat of the Poles who tried to conquer Moscow in 1604. Well, this 400-year-old holiday or event was never, was not given much attention before. Now they're celebrating it all over and for several days. Um, they're having ceremonies in the schools in which they ask people who've come back from what they call the special military operation to talk about their heroism. Uh, it's when there's a funeral, in a lot of Russian villages and and neighborhoods, the whole neighborhood turns out, and those who are being recruited, they're being paid a lot, and they're big death payments, and so the prospect of all that money has actually also had an effect. So you have this war psychology plus reinforced with more money than people have seen in their lives. There was one clip that I saw from Russian television that just sums it up, I think, and that you could only see in Russia. It's the story of a father and a mother who have received a payment because of their son's death. And they've taken that payment and gone out and bought a shiny new car. And they're interviewed, and they're saying that the first thing they're going to do in that car is drive to the cemetery to visit the grave of their son. Just to show, how they're benefiting from this carnage. So, and then we come to so with this kind of cult of death, how could we expect Navalny to survive in a labor camp when he was in opposition and when he was completely in their hands?
Well, I
And of
can't
course he
help
didn't.
but wonder he didn't,
Mhm.
right? And I want to show everyone a map in just a moment so you can kind of talk us through where Navalny was and why he was
Mhm.
moved
Sure.
there and some of the background to it. Because for eh, Navalny, just for some of our audience, stories about him would periodically come up, but
Mhm.
it wasn't something that was consistent all the time, at least in the US press. So the news of his death made worldwide headlines, but you kind of would get these different touch points of what things were happening with him. So I think it'd be good to talk a little bit about that, David. Before we get there, how
Yeah.
popular is Putin right now in Russia?
Good question. No one knows. I think the short answer is no one knows. There is certainly a part of the population that is supporting Putin, supporting the war. In fact, I heard about someone I knew years ago in Moscow. It was a good friend of mine. When I first went to Moscow as a graduate student, who, to my regret, is a staunch backer of the war and of Putin. And when he was asked about the various terrorist acts, he says, "Well, I don't believe it." He doesn't believe it. But the thing is that people realize that the war has not gone, that the so-called special military operation, which they refuse to call a war, has not gone well. They understand that there's mobilization, that people can end up there. In some cases, the amount of time that elapses between the moment that a person, say a middle-aged guy, well, middle-aged in the sense of 30s, who has a civilian job, receives what's called a povestka, that's a notification to report for military service, and the time he returns in a coffin is as little as 5 weeks. So how does this affect his popularity, Putin's? Because he's the one, of course, who's behind all this. We can't be sure. We saw during the Prigozhin revolt that Prigozhin and the soldiers of the Wagner group were able to travel 450 miles in 24 hours without meeting any resistance. And when they moved into the city of Rostov, which is the headquarters of the Southern Military Command for Russia, they were treated, they got a very warm welcome from the population. So I think that if the Ukrainians can land a decisive blow against the Russian forces, the fragility of Putin's support could become obvious. As long as he seems to be into control, people will be afraid, and they will also be kind of hoping, well, look, this is going to end. We can't allow Russia to be defeated, and Putin is standing in the way of that, even though Putin is the one who created a situation in Russia in which Russia could be defeated.
I want to show everyone that map now. If we could just look at Ukraine. And you mentioned a couple of things there, David, and it's bringing up all the very interesting twists and turns of the story. As you mentioned, Prigozhin was a leader of the Wagner group, which is this mercenary dark force, somehow independent, but connected to the Russian military. And he led a revolt, a short-lived revolt against Vladimir Putin that was eventually sort of put down. And we don't, again, know exactly what happened behind closed doors, but Prigozhin is now dead. There was a plane accident or a murder, depending on how people report it, and he is no longer with us.
I think it was an accident.
I mean,
that was made to happen.
You know, the journalist in me wants to be extra cautious, right, David? Because
of course,
we don't have that precise fact of this, but we also have to speak very frankly about the timing of all of this. And timing is something I want to talk to you about too. So just as everyone can see the map of Ukraine and also Russia, I think it was important that you mentioned that we started with talking a little bit about 2014, because 2014 was when Russia and Ukraine really had a battle over the annexation of Crimea, which is in the southeast part of Ukraine. And Russia went in, annexed or took that territory back. And there's been a battle in that specific area, fighting that's been taking place since 2014. The plane that David mentioned is really important. This Malaysian flight filled with people just like us, families that were going on a trip totally unrelated to this conflict. This plane gets shot out of the sky and all the people are killed. And the world sort of watches in horror of this happening. But the consequences to that never really materialized. But it gives you an idea of the technology that was involved in the battle at that time in 2014 and the risks that were being taken by Russia specifically, but by both sides. The fighting was kinetic, not as kinetic as what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. But it's important to have that background that was happening. And some of those stories are very easy to forget, and we shouldn't forget that happened, that innocent people have been killed in this conflict that had nothing to do with Ukraine and nothing to do with Russia. So as we're looking at the map of Russia now, David, can you talk to us a little bit about who Alexey Navalny was, where he was imprisoned, and why it matters?
He was imprisoned in the Yamel Peninsula, which actually is not quite shown on that map. But
let me show you another one. Here's
Yeah,
another one
it
that
would
shows
be.
more of
Yeah, it
Russia.
would be right, very close to the center of that map. It's first of all, it's a peninsula that's sticking up into the Arctic Ocean, about on the northern coast of of Russia, and it's very remote. It's very, very, very remote. It's I was once in a town called Nefteyugansk, which is also extremely remote, but somewhat not too, we're an oil producing town, which but the Yamal Peninsula, the area where I think it was in the Khanty-Mansisk region where Navalny was kept. It's a remote area, but the point is that Russia is full of such areas. It's a huge, huge, huge country geographically, and the idea was just to put him in a place where they could do whatever they wanted with him whenever they decided to do so. And that's, I'm sure, what happened here. Remember, they tried to kill him once with Novichok. Novichok is contact poison. And there was another case in England when the Sergei Skripal, a former Russian intelligence officer who defected, was practically killed because Novichok was put on his on the knob of his doorknob of his home. So it's no, it's, you can't see Novichok. You don't know that it's there. It would have been no problem for them. In the case of the first time they poisoned Navalny, they got into his room and somehow put it on his in his underwear. And but he was flown to Germany. He was saved, and then he very bravely went back to Russia. But you have to understand, in the kind of situation in a labor camp where they're barracks, it's no problem to apply contact poison to something that a prisoner touches, and for him then to drop dead, and then they say that it was a thrombosis. So of course we were not there. We didn't see exactly what happens, but we know that they're liars. I mean, if they were telling the truth, they would have no hesitance about allowing Navalny's mother to reclaim his body. And the fact that they don't do that is a sign of just how barbaric they are. Something that we should keep in mind, and that our people in Congress should keep in mind.
Why now? They attempted to murder this man in the past. Why now? Why do you think
Well,
now was the moment?
I mean, there are various theories. You can never know what's going on in their minds. Uh, why now? He was active he used every possibility to call attention to abuses from within the prison, uh, up to a point that was even in their interest to allow that to continue, to show, well, he's well, and and nobody's harming him, and to give the impression in the West that even though he's imprisoned, he's not going to be touched. And then when the time came, they decided they would touch him. And why now? Well, they're going to have a phony presidential election in March. Maybe they want it, but it's they don't even, they may have wanted to remove somebody who can call attention to how phony it is, but not necessarily. They don't even need a reason. They may just have said, "Well, time's up." They've eliminated. Why did they kill Boris Nemtsov, the Democratic leader in 2015, who was shot to death on the Zamoskvoretsky Bridge, right by the Kremlin? He was a personal friend of mine. Why did they do it at that time and not later or earlier? I mean, we there's a Russian saying, "I wasn't holding a candle." We weren't there with a candle when they were discussing it, so we don't know exactly what was going through their minds. But we see the result. We see that the same regime that was ready to shoot down a civilian airliner flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur that was ready to murder uh, opposition leaders like Boris Nemtsov, Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, although he was already in exile in London. By the way, he was poisoned with a nuclear isotope. And now Navalny was this is the same regime which carried out this aggression against Ukraine, sacrifice at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives now. And by the way, it's the same regime which came to power through a terrorist act against its own people by blowing up the apartment buildings in 1999, a fact which our government failed to acknowledge and to challenge at the time it happened, even though they had ample evidence that this was a terrorist attack carried out by the intelligence service in order to bring Putin to power. At a time when we could have prevented it, or at least, we could have called attention to what this regime really was and based our policy accordingly. This is why the war was preventable, but it would have taken realism and knowledge on the part of our people, which we didn't have.
Your sigh is well timed, and we feel that sigh with you, David, and in your frustration and description of needing
Well,
to
I
have a
in
realistic view
particular
of
made
Russia.
efforts, to Jenna, for made
Of
made made
course.
serious efforts. All these to call attention to this.
Well, and just so our
Um,
audience knows, you're the one that led a lot of the investigative reporting into the bombings of these apartment buildings, these explosions that took place. And just for a quick review, and you could do better than me, David, but these were residential apartment buildings. So imagine you're in, wherever you're living, these apartment buildings are high rises, and just they're blowing up in the middle of the night. Think about the terror that was taking place in that community. And there was all of this pointing to, oh, these are the terrorists that were part of
yeah,
Russia at the time. And you found that no, there was actually evidence that Vladimir Putin and the government were behind it in order to garner support. Did I do a fair job summarizing? What would you like to fill
yeah,
in there?
yeah.
I'm sure there's a
This
lot.
is it. I mean, these were buildings that it terrorized the whole country. These were buildings in working class areas. Just people who were not political opponents. They were chosen at random. They were random victims. That's the thing that's so diabolical about it. You could understand somebody trying to get rid of of those who their enemies, but these are people who in many cases may have even been supporters of Putin or of the government. But they were blown up as they slept. They went to sleep and didn't wake up. But the whole thing is so fantastic and this was the great protection that Putin and his gang had, which is that it's so fantastic, no one's going to believe it. A normal resident of the UK, of the US, of a civilized country, and you tell them that the government blew up their own people in order to come to power, they will say, "What, are you crazy?" He says nobody can do something like that. And of course, if you take as the frame of reference the UK or the US or other Western countries, or France, for example, where I'm going, you'd be right. Uh, but you wouldn't be right about Russia. And in fact, there's historical precedent for it because when Stalin launched the war against Finland in 1940, the first thing they did was they bombed, they shelled their own troops and killed them, and then accused the Finns of doing it, and that was the reason that was the excuse for starting the war. So it's not, it's very much in character, actually.
Well, and I want to talk to you more about that character and
Yeah,
this block of time that we were able to observe Vladimir Putin in this interview with Tucker Carlson. Before I get to that, because I have quite a few notes about that I want to summarize for our audience too. How would you describe the loss of Navalny? How do you think that will impact the the Russian population of opposition against Vladimir Putin?
I think it'll register. There's a lot of propaganda against Navalny, and as you may have seen, so-called activists are tearing up impromptu memorials. People are creating memorials to Navalny in various cities. They're putting flowers, putting his picture up in public places, and then pro-Putin activists are tearing it all down. But Russian public opinion is a little bit different from public opinion in the West. People will believe the propaganda, or at least they act as if they believe it, and they close their eyes to opposing evidence for a very long time, until suddenly there's a moment of realization, and they understand that they've been lied to. And are we reaching such a point? Just hard to say. Russia is such a volatile country. There was, I think Bismarck said, there are two things we can never know: what the weather will be tomorrow and what's going to happen in Russia. And it's still true. I mean, we never expected the Prigozhin revolt. Just suddenly, an army of cutthroats is on the way to Moscow, and they cover 450 miles in 24 hours. That's
But you
no
said
one.
that you said that about the fall of the Soviet Union too, though. From the inside, when it happened fast, like it almost at a surprising rate. And
Absolutely,
that's
yeah.
why
It was faster
I'm
than
always
anyone.
curious, could this happen in 24 hours? And suddenly there's a massive change. It seems unbelievable, but there's so many things that seem unbelievable regarding Russia right now. I don't want to not consider it.
Russia's an unbelievable country. Russia is a country in which, in fact, as I wrote, you have to believe the unbelievable. Once you understand that the impossible is really possible, then everything in Russia makes sense. But for a normal person to comprehend what goes on there is not easy. It takes an effort of imagination. But the things, if the Ukrainians really score a breakthrough, and of course this is also a question of Western aid, it's a question of the American political situation, but if they do, things could change very fast. They could. We're on the outside. We don't know everything that's going on, but I know from my experience that there are people in the Russian military, there are people in the security services who understand that Putin is leading the country to disaster, and that he's sacrificing the lives of innocent young Russians and Ukrainians for his personal ambitions. And I can tell you that when I investigated the apartment bombings many years ago, there were people like that who provided me with information, and they exist. But we have to, if the West and the U.S. in particular shows that the only thing we care about are our own internal problems, that's not much encouragement for those forces who basically are on our side.
Well, let's talk about the Vladimir Putin interview, because this was the
Mhm.
first time in a long time we've seen him in front of a camera for 2 hours answering questions from an American media personality. And so,
Right.
if I could just summarize quickly for our audience, the interview lasted 2 hours. It is a challenging interview to navigate, because Vladimir Putin is speaking in Russian the entire time. So you're dealing with the translation, and the pacing of the interview is a little bit off because of that. But he's sitting in this very well lit space, a chair. He's not ruffled ever. He doesn't seem to be disturbed ever by any of the questioning. He's perfectly lit, by the way. He looks calm. He looks alert, and he really is engaging with Tucker Carlson in a way that we haven't seen, in this sort of almost like a podcast format because of the length of time of this interview. A couple of the notable things that stand out to me is he starts the interview with this long history of Russia and Ukraine. And this is something we've seen from him before in some of the speeches that he's given, where he really goes into depth about, the 1,000-year history of Russia. He never calls the Ukraine war a war. As David mentioned, it's a special military operation. But as you're sitting there listening to him, you are reminded about how long he's been in power. He talks about meeting with President Clinton, President H.W. Bush, President Bush. He talks a little bit about President Biden. He talks about the major players in the CIA and the cabinets that he's met with. So you see, he's covered decades and decades of American leadership. And there's two things that he talks about a lot. And he's constantly kind of casting doubt on the American president and insinuating, and sometimes not even insinuating, directly saying that the CIA or the covert services are the ones that are really in charge. And they're the ones that are sort of the puppet masters in the background. That's definitely something he talks about. He talks about how the CIA, he believes, supported radical Islamic terrorists in Russia and that they were behind this opposition against him. And these are terrorists, but the CIA is supporting terrorists because they want to get him out of power. And there's very little, there's very few questions. I was interested. There was almost no questions that I can recall now, if I really think about it in this moment, where Tucker Carlson asked Vladimir Putin about his vision for his own leadership, what's going on inside of Russia, how people feel about him. It's all about this kind of outward looking at the world. And one of the other things Vladimir Putin says repeatedly is, well, I had an opportunity to maybe join NATO, but that offer was rescinded, and I'm not here to have war. I'm here to negotiate. I've constantly been trying to negotiate. I've been trying to negotiate, but none of this has been done in good faith. And that's why I can't negotiate anymore. And that's sort of, those are some of the big takeaways. The summary, if I can, David, it's in depth. There's a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover there. But what stood out most to you? What you've seen Vladimir Putin for years. What do you think, for someone who hasn't seen the interview? Is there anything new that you saw in Vladimir Putin that stood out to you, or anything notable that you think it's important for our audience to know?
Well, I think what's notable is the behavior of Tucker Carlson. Putin was doing what he always does, but that Tucker served as an uncritical conduit. He didn't answer and give him a single intelligent question, with the possible exception of raising the issue of Evan Gershkovich. But just from the point of view of journalism, it was a disgrace. I'm a journalist. I was a Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times. I would never have conducted such an interview.
What did you want to see asked? What would you want to see asked that wasn't asked?
Well, I would ask him, why is it that you said in 2002 at the joint press conference, for example, with Leonid Kravchuk, the president of Ukraine, that Russia has absolutely no objections to Ukraine joining NATO because Ukraine is an independent country and Russia respects Ukrainian independence? Why did he say that? Why did he say in 2007 that Russia has no designs on Crimea? We recognize Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea. Why did Russia sign a treaty of friendship with Ukraine in which it affirmed the boundaries of Ukraine? Why did they sign, in fact, nearly 250 agreements, treaties, bilateral agreements, all of which were based on Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders? That's one thing. I would have asked him about the apartment bombings, of course. He said, who blew up those buildings? How is it that you came to power? Why is it that no Chechens who have ever been arrested in connection with those buildings, but FSB agents were arrested and found trying to put a bomb in another building? How do you explain that? How do you explain the fact that Gennady Seleznov, who was the Speaker of the Duma, announced one of the bombings 2 days before it happened? How did he know about that? What about the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner? why did you immediately get on the phone afterward when this was something that was supposedly taking place in another sovereign country, and say that we have to, stop the fighting between the Ukrainians and the separatists? And how is it possible that you moved into an area like that, a weapon capable of shooting down civilian airliners, and theoretically put it in the hands of separatists who are basically composed of the veterans of the prisons and the mental hospitals, and left it in their hands? And why is it that separatists deny that, in fact, they fired the fatal shot? I mean, you could go, listen, we could be here all day.
Well, this is
and
I actually think this is important, and this is why
this is what a journalist is supposed to do. A journalist is supposed to go into an interview knowing, you don't interview a head of state, especially one as sinister and as murderous as Putin, and then just allow him to say anything he wants.
Well, I will say this. I don't have a strong opinion on any. As my audience knows, we're strictly nonpartisan. I do have a strong feeling about American journalism. It's why I don't refer to the Tucker Carlson interview. I don't refer to him as a journalist. I refer to him as a host. And this is what we saw. We didn't necessarily see the journalist conducting an interview, even if he would call himself that. That's not. He's a host, and so you saw him do his show, and he has a certain point of view and a certain skepticism of the American government that you also see in this interview. And yet I'm also grateful, and I'm not in the pack of American journalists who say, well, he should not have done it. I think it's important for the world to see Putin in action. I think it's important to see him, even if he's talking about propaganda. Otherwise, there's a visceral reaction to watching him. There's something there under the lights that I think is always important. More information is better than others. That's my argument, anyways.
We give him a forum. You say there were 200 million people who watched the interview.
Yep, and growing.
And growing, is it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We'll give him a forum to say a lot of, and he says a lot of things that can easily be challenged. And he makes statements, on the question of the statehood of Ukraine, or Ukraine being an artificial country or not a real country. Ukraine and Russia were created at the same time in 1923. There were 4 so-called independent republics that came together to form the Soviet Union. Russian Federated Republic was one of them. Ukraine was another. So if Ukraine is an artificial country, so is Russia, because they were created at the same time.
But see, this is an opportunity to clarify, right? We wouldn't even be talking about this if he wasn't able to talk. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. David, can I play a soundbite with Tucker Carlson?
Of course.
I want our audience to pay attention to how this is a rather long soundbite. It's about 2 minutes. So thank you for your patience in advance. I want you to listen to how Vladimir Putin uses some of our own headlines in his answer, and then we'll ask David about it. So here's an example of what took place in the interview.
Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine. He has territorial aims across the continent, and you're saying unequivocally you don't.
It is absolutely out of the question. You just don't have to be any kind of analyst. It goes against common sense to get involved in some kind of a global war. And a global war will bring all humanity to the brink of destruction. It's obvious. There are certainly means of deterrence. They have been scaring everyone with us all along. Tomorrow Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tomorrow Russia will use that. No, the day after tomorrow. So what? In order to extort additional money from US taxpayers and European taxpayers in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible.
One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
This is a provocation, and a cheap provocation at that. I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place, and mercenaries from Georgia in third place. Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine?
I'll stop it there so people have just kind of a sense of how this interview went. David, you're kind of, what's your reaction to that? That covered a lot of ground. That was a good, as I was looking back on this soundbite, I thought this is actually a good cut. There was so much to cut. I wasn't sure, but this was actually really good.
That's a good
right?
section.
You see him and you see how he's sitting there, laying back. He's not even sitting up. He's kind of leaning back in his chair, talking about. Of course,
he's very comfortable. He's very comfortable.
I'm not trying to take over any other countries. I mean, if you guys want to do something like that, it's going to be war. But like, we're not. That's a provocation. What are you talking about? And you have the border, and you have debt. You got all this stuff.
The border, what's your reaction to it? Of course, that's aimed at the opposition to the war in the U.S. Because he's echoing and they do that they've done that all the time. They used to do that in the days of the Soviet Union as well. They would say you're spending money on defense when you have such social problems, you have racial injustice, et cetera, et cetera. They love to mimic the the points of those who are opposed to confronting them. But this is what we get back to something you were saying, Jenna, that just put him out there, let people see see what he is. But the problem is that without a little guidance and without a little help, most people will not see what he is. They don't speak Russian. They've never spent time in Russia. They don't understand what kind of society Russia is. It's a society in which you can send unarmed, poorly armed, poorly trained people who've been just pulled out of civilian life in human waves to be slaughtered over a war that should have never taken place in the first place. And that's not, it's a country where one group of people is ready to blow up apartment buildings in order to create a pretext for coming to power. This is outside the realm of imagination for most Americans. So when they see someone sitting there very politely, repeating the points that are made by their own domestic politicians, they may not be equipped to understand what lies behind it. And Tucker in this, I mean, we say, well, he's a host, he's not a journalist. But if you're interviewing a world leader, you look like a journalist. Absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you. He's not a journalist, but he gives that impression. And as you see, the audience is huge because people think they're going to learn something. But in fact, this is manipulation, which is being abetted by an American who uses the credibility that he has won with some people on the woke issue to enter into a sphere in which he knows nothing. And even minimal knowledge would have made it possible for him to answer some of the things that Putin was saying. Why did he not ask, for example, about the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner? Why did Russia provide Buk anti-aircraft missile batteries capable of shooting down objects at 40,000 feet to a group of separatists that didn't that basically were engaged on the ground? What
There's so
exactly?
much to ask.
Once you get, this is not kindergarten. This is, people are dying here, and they're dying in great numbers and under terrible conditions. I was in Kyiv not long ago, when there was an air raid, and I went down to the bomb shelters with everybody else. The thing is that, and we came out, and the people had been killed in a building not very far away. So it requires, I think, a certain level of responsibility. Now we can say, we can excoriate Tucker Carlson, but the superficiality goes deeper. I mean, it's superficiality in our Congress, superficiality even on the part of those people who consider themselves oftentimes experts on Russia, but are not willing, to make the effort and do what Tucker's doing, which is, just rely on Russian sources, are not critical, don't try to investigate, don't try to understand what lies beneath the surface. But a great power, which is what the U.S. is, has to have a great sense of responsibility. So
how do we overcome that superficiality? What's the key?
I wish I knew. I've dealt with this for decades, literally. There are two things that are required for dealing with Russia. One is imagination, the readiness the ability to understand that a country like Russia is very, very different than the United States, and it operates according to different rules. And the other is commitment, and that is the readiness not to be satisfied with superficial lies and manipulation.
What's so interesting about that, David, is that you're saying in order to have a realistic view of Russia, you actually have to indulge your imagination, which I think is a little bit of a puzzle for people, that we just want to deal with facts. And this is there is certainly a crisis in confidence of who to trust. I mean, this is why Smarter News exists, because who do you trust? Why does Tucker Carlson have that audience? Because people don't know who to turn to, and they're looking for information, and they see this interview and are curious. And I think there's a real lesson in there, obviously, for the American press too, of what the audience needs, which is more depth, which is more conversations like this one. I'm so grateful to you, David, because you're allowing us to sidestep that superficiality and go deeper. Without you, I don't know how we would do it.
This is what we have to do. The thing is, what has happened in the U.S., and this is really, I've talked to you about this separately. I was a Rhodes Scholar years ago, and now we're engaged in the Rhodes Scholarship has been taken over by kind of a woke psychology, which is threatening to really, in my view, destroy it. And I'm involved in an effort to return the scholarship to its emphasis on excellence that it had when I was lucky enough to get it. But and this is a really critical point, what our people don't understand is the degree to which this victim psychology is subverting all relationships in the U.S. On the one hand, it's those people who operate on the basis of common sense are disoriented by it and they don't like it, and they're perfect. But we can't say that necessarily those people who form Tucker Carlson's audience therefore know everything about everything. I mean, they're fine when they deal with common sense, but unfortunately, in their frustration, they can go way overboard in the other direction and draw a lot of conclusions that aren't warranted. And we see that in the attitude toward Ukraine. The problem is that when all of this is being put out by respectable news outlets, by universities that people are accustomed to thinking of as prestigious, it creates a distrust of information generally and a distrust of expertise. And that's where we get a situation in which a lot of people start who, maybe initially commonsensical. And I think some of what Carlson did on woke issues was common sense. But he didn't stay with common sense. He tried to move out and become an expert in lots of areas that require serious study. We're getting into a situation in which people who rely on common sense and are the backbone of the country in a way because of their appreciation of because they have common sense, have been so offended by by what theory and positions that pretend to be virtuous but in fact are self-serving, that they themselves lose orientation. So this is why we have such a divided country. I think that this is one of the reasons why Tucker Carlson, with no background whatsoever in Russian or Ukrainian affairs, is able to conduct an interview with the Russian head of state and get 200 million views, even though logic would suggest he shouldn't be anywhere near.
It's an interesting point you're making, that there are some a very interesting point. And if I could hopefully say it back to you too, so for clarity for all of us, is that there's been this backlash in society on more social issues where people that feel like I have a more commonsensical view of society, if you will, of like what's right and wrong, are validated through some of the coverage from someone like Tucker Carlson. But when you're dealing with these other affairs, these other topics, that it gets more muddled and confusing. And where you think you could trust someone for some common sense on these social issues, it gets expanded unnaturally in a way that kind of leads to this question of, well, who's an expert, right? Who's an expert? Who's an authority on this? Who do we actually trust? What does that actually look like in America today? And it's sort of this period where I'm sure, I certainly feel it myself, but there's a great uncertainty about, well, who are the sources and how do you find them in this social media superficial age? This is the problem.
Especially since the Russians will do their best to create phony. They're great at putting out disinformation and creating phony experts for us. Let me
ask you about. Can I?
Yeah,
I would ask you about that because there's no one else we can ask this question about Vladimir Putin, David, and that is his knowledge of American leadership. I shouldn't say knowledge. His relationships with American presidents, his time in office. It's so long. And as he's talking about these presidents that he has out-survived, right? Because he's not leaving office. There was one interlude there for a little bit, but he's not leaving office. It was like we don't see anything like that in the United States, where someone's in power talking about, all these world leaders that they've met all the time. It just was, as he was rifling through them, it was sort of stunning in his recall and the breadth of people that he's interacted with. You mentioned previously in the interview, just a few moments ago, about his personal ambitions. What are his personal ambitions? And what do you think the accumulative time and power equips him with uniquely in this world that other world leaders don't have, simply don't have?
Well, I mean, there are reports which our intelligence believes are accurate that he's the richest man in the world. But I suppose that's not enough for him. Came to power through an act of terror, consolidated power through acts of terror, launched aggressive wars, not just against Ukraine, but also against Georgia, is now embroiled in a war in which hundreds of thousands of people have either been killed or wounded. I think that the driving motivation for him is just to stay in power and to preserve the power of himself and the small group that's around him. And the Russian people are an instrument for achieving that purpose. And in the interest of that goal, he's ready to inflict any kind of horror on the countries that border Russia, and he's certainly ready to threaten the West.
Is he ready to
and
die for
he's
those
done.
things?
No, he himself is not ready to die, and then we come to the key here. His willingness to sacrifice the lives of others does not mean that he's willing to sacrifice his own life. And if his own life were threatened, or if he understood that it was in his interest, you would see him withdraw from Ukraine tomorrow, and the war would end. But he's not convinced of that. That's what the war in Chechnya in the 1990s ended when it was clear that Yeltsin, in those days, they did have something resembling elections, although they were dishonest, could not be reelected as long as that war continued. And then the Chechens, scored a decisive victory, and the Russians pulled out ahead of time. Same thing could happen in Ukraine. And they would then present the retreat as a great victory. But he's not. These are not ideological fanatics. It's not as if they believe in some kind of, pseudo-religious idea. They're ready to use any kind of brutality and they commit any kind of crime. But what the essence of what's going on is the material self-interest of a small kleptocratic group, and they will justify it by saying they're creating the Russian world, or that they're restoring the empire of the czars, or something like that. But they know that's not possible. In fact, they're pretty indifferent to it. But they're not indifferent to their own welfare. This is what was created in Russia. This was what was created historically. This was the result of, in effect, the failure of the reforms. The fact that we in our blindness, encouraged the criminal takeover of the country after the fall of communism. It was not Democrats who took over Russia. It was criminals. And that criminal regime could only be preserved with the help of terrorism. And that's what happened in 1999. And Putin was the product. And, the regime was running down. In 2014, they annexed Crimea, and that gave that unleashed a wave of patriotic fervor. They wanted the same effect with the invasion of Ukraine. The problem was that the Ukrainians resisted.
There's so many more questions I have for you, David, but you've already been so generous with us always, as you are with your time. I have sort of a final long one, if you'll indulge me for a
Sure,
second here.
absolutely.
This is an article from the Washington Post that is a report that came out last week. The headline, with the dire warning, concerns rise about conflict in space with Russia. And it's citing sources. It doesn't have anyone officially on the record. This is people familiar with classified intelligence on the matter, talking about this new, very scary potential capability that Russia has had or is developing but has not deployed. And if I could reflect back for a moment on what we heard from Vladimir Putin in the Tucker Carlson interview, and this is a good way to tie it together with our audience, is that you see a headline like this, you think of Vladimir Putin and what he said of this false provocation that the West is trying to gin up against him. And you look at a headline like that and you wonder, well, what am I supposed to make of all of this? The world is scary enough. And then we have this issue with Ukraine funding in front of Congress, and this question: if the United States doesn't participate, the Ukraine's military, we know, cannot survive without aid from multiple sources. And
No,
then just add another layer. This weekend on Smarter News was President's Day, and I did a report on George Washington's farewell address. So I'm going to pull in 1796 to this conversation, David. I think we can do it. We're going to do it. And this is where President Washington is talking about foreign affairs. And he's saying, listen, really, there's no interest that the United States should pursue for allies or adversaries alike, because in either situation, you're blinded to the needs of your own people, and you're really under false pretenses to act in ways that you may not otherwise act. And his argument is, really, when it comes to foreign policy, we should stay clear of it unless it has to do with commercial gains, when it has to do with the economy. And so I know that's a lot to kind of think about in the last few minutes of our conversation, but this is what's ahead of Congress right now. There's a question of aid and more involvement overseas in this issue. There's a question about future threats and wanting to make sure we protect not only us now, but future generations, and make the right investment for that. But then there's also this question of, well, what have we learned in the last several hundred years when it comes to our own involvement overseas, and how fruitful that's been for the American people? And so I find myself thinking about all those things sort of at one time. And I'm wondering, as you see those vastly different topics, what stands out most to you? What do you think about?
Well, we resisted the Nazis, and so there was no German takeover of Europe, and no situation in which the rules of the world was set by Adolf Hitler. We resisted the communists, and in the end, communism fell. So the rules in the world were not set by the communists. Now we have a coalition kind of criminal regimes, which would also like to set the rules for the world. What does it mean? For example, we had a case where Alexander Litvinenko in Britain, a Russian defector but a British subject, was poisoned with a nuclear isotope on British soil, and in which other British citizens were endangered. In the case of Sergei Skripal, the attempted murder, a British woman who came in contact with Novichok, she died. But right now, because of the power of the United States, because of the power of the West, these criminal tendencies are to some extent kept in check. What if they have free reign? What if they can do whatever they want? Do we want to live with that? We have had the luxury of living in a world in which people with decent values basically set the rules, not the criminals, and not the ideological criminals. Do we want to change that? Do we want to be I mean, who do we want to be beholden to them? Let's say Ukraine is defeated because we decided that we're tired of spending money on arms while they're giving up their lives. And a resurgent Russia then decides to threaten Estonia. We can say, well, we defended, we weren't ready to defend Ukraine, even to the extent of providing weapons, but we're ready to defend Estonia with our lives. Who's going to believe that? And if we don't defend Estonia, the Western alliance collapses. And if we don't have the Western alliance, then who's in charge? Sometimes it takes, the average person either understands this. If he understands it at all, he understands it on the level of common sense, intuitively, because most people don't deal with these problems. They live their lives. They have other concerns. They care about their families. Fortunately, in the United States, we've always had a reservoir of common sense, sufficient to guide us in the right direction. But under the impact of this so-called woke revolution, common sense we're challenged now. We're challenged to see whether we as a country have what it takes to defend our common purposes, and to understand that what we have in common is more important than the things that divide us. It's something that I think we're going to meet the challenge. I hope we will, but it's a source of concern. We can't be sure.
You sounded a little bit like George Washington there at the end there, David, because he was talking about making sure that we focus not on the regional differences, not on the differences that we have
Well,
between
we
local
should.
and federal government. And that was one of his messages, that you have to come together and you have to believe in America, not just where you are and not just with your own community, albeit important. So I know you're going to be traveling overseas. I know you went to Ukraine. Do you get nervous traveling, David? One of the things is you're talking about the criminal enterprise, like criminal setting the moral code in the world sounds terrible. But one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're rattling off these different crimes committed by Russia, the criminal enterprise is active and is already outside of Russia. Do you get nervous
It
traveling?
is
Do you get
active.
concerned?
It's active. It's outside of Russia, but for the moment, at least, I think that we have enough power in the world to deter them from doing, just anything they want. But it pays to be cautious too.
Do you get nervous at all?
Well, I don't think that getting nervous would be very productive, but I'm aware of the situation and aware of what of what might happen or might not happen. It doesn't prevent me from saying what I think needs to be said, and nor will it do so in the future. But that's but I know who we're dealing with.
And we appreciate that insight, David, because it gives us an idea of who we're dealing with too. And I don't think without your insight, I don't think we would have it.
So. I hope so.
Well, we appreciate you, David, and I appreciate your time as always, and look forward to your work and hearing from you as you go on with your travels and your work and your research. And thank you for giving us these insights. They are incredibly valuable, and I know every time we talk, our audience walks away from the conversation feeling more empowered and more knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. Not necessarily that we have all the answers, but that we have a little bit more than what we started, and that's of great value. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.